So aperture and depth of field. In the last lecture, I talked about shutter speeds, and before that about lenses, what we call bigger and smaller apertures. In this lecture, I want to take some time to focus more closely on aperture because it's one of those basic controls. The aperture is the variable hole in the lens that light passes through on the way to your camera's sensor or film. Different shutter speeds let in different amounts of light through the lenses, right? But apertures, it's so critical, so key. So let's pick up our camera again. We're going to put that strap around our neck so we don't drop it. But listen, here's the thing. Different lenses permit f-stops, different f-stops or aperture settings. Here's how I change the aperture on my camera. Your camera may be different. Very simple. Set that, rotate the dial. That's it. Simple as that. Pretty easy these days, okay? Most mid-level cameras, film or digital, offer you a way to control your aperture, so take advantage of that. So again, aperture is a basic camera setting that scrolls through the numbers and makes the lens opening bigger or smaller. Let's talk about why that's important. We talked about aperture settings in an earlier lecture, but it is critical. I'm not kidding. I'm going to go over it again. It's so critical. Lower aperture numbers mean big openings in the lens. Higher aperture numbers mean smaller holes in the lens, right? A big opening means a smaller number, like f2.8 or f2 even. Smaller the number is, the bigger the hole. These f-stops represent a ratio, the ratio of the focal length of the lens to the diameter of the aperture. Standard f-stops, from largest opening to smallest, are, with a few exceptions, f1.4, that's a really big hole, f2, f2.8, f4, getting smaller, f5.6, f8, f11, and f16 is tiny. Some lenses will go to 22, 30-something, 45. It's amazing. Let's look at the effect here of these different apertures. Okay, this is my daughter Ellen, looking a little sullen because she has to pose for her dad yet again for another picture. She's awful gripey. I got to bribe her with ice cream every time. Now let's watch this. Look at the background here. Blurry, blurry, blurry. What's that going to be? It's going to be a big hole in the lens, isn't it? Let's go through these and look. Look at this. As we go. Look at that. The background all of a sudden got sharper. How in the world did that happen? Well, it's happening because the hole in the lens is getting smaller. That's how it's happening. We're on a tripod, so the scene is locked down. She's moving a little bit because she's fidgety. She doesn't want to be there, of course. But as we're going through, look at this. The background's getting sharper and sharper and sharper as we go through. Now back to the first one. Let's compare. First picture, wide open hole in the lens. Last picture, same girl, same moment in time, same living room. Lots of depth of field. Small hole in the lens. Big hole in the lens, no depth of field at all. Simple as that. That's it. Okay, that makes sense, doesn't it? I get it. All right, let's try it one more time. Same girl, same bad attitude. All right, I don't blame her. I've photographed her since the moment she was born. She's been photographed hundreds of thousands of times. Okay, shallow depth of field. Watch this hole getting smaller. Here we go. Watch it getting smaller. Watch that background get sharper and sharper and sharper. Look at that. Very sharp now. Back to one. Big hole in the lens, f2.8 here. No depth of field. Tiny hole in the lens. Lots of depth of field. But you know what? Sometimes you don't want a lot of depth of field. It just depends what you want. It really does. Think about this. Aperture can control exposure. Certainly does, but it creates visual effects that solve compositional problems. A wide open aperture can solve these problems by having only one layer of the photo in focus. In those pictures of Ellen, maybe you don't want picture frames coming out of her head. That big hole in the lens, that softens the background, really makes her stand out. So in a complicated, chaotic world, we like shallow depth of field. We really do. It's a great tool. The smaller the hole in the lens, the more things are in focus. Easy. Small hole equals more depth of field. The bigger the hole or aperture, the less depth of field or area of the photo will be in focus from front to back. I know I'm going over this like you're in kindergarten, but I cannot tell you how important this is. This is a big one, okay? Right away, I can hear you guys thinking this. Why wouldn't I want a tiny hole in my lens so the whole world's in focus all the time? That seems like such a appropriate and right thing to do? Well, I can tell you why. You're gonna have everything in focus all the time? The world is a chaotic place, and this is gonna be a problem for you if you care about your backgrounds, right? If you live in any place that isn't, say, Antarctica, where there's nothing but ice and penguins and nice and clean, that's fine. Have a tiny little hole in your lens, lots of depth of field. But you live in a modern day society, don't you, like me? You're looking at power poles and houses and bridges and white moving vans and people and buildings. The world is a busy place visually. Maybe you want to clean that up. Maybe you want a shallow depth of field. But having a shallow depth of field allows us to simplify, really, doesn't it? And really choose what we want in focus and what we do not. It really allows us to get directly to the subject, and it helps make our subjects pop. I heard this years ago. There was a great guitarist who says, it's not the notes I play, it's the notes I don't play. So what do you want to exclude? What do you want to exclude? That is so critical. It's not what you leave in, it's what you leave out, okay? There are times that, sure, you want the whole world in focus, but there are many other times that you want to be selective in how much depth of field you have. Be selective, be discriminating. Discriminate. All right, let's look at this first picture so you can see what I'm talking about here. Let's look at this, okay? We've seen this. Grizzly bear bobbing for salmon on a river in Alaska, all right? It's very late in the day, very late, so there's hardly any light left at all. It's well after sunset. His eyes are glowing gold, believe it or not. Grizzly bears have gold eye shine because I'm hitting him with a little bit of flash. It's nearly dark out. I can barely see anything. I've got to make a good exposure. So we want a big hole in the lens, a wide open aperture to try to soak up as much of that weak light as possible, right? If you shoot in very soft, subtle light like I do all the time, this will become a very familiar concept to you in short order. Big hole in the lens, small aperture number. Okay. Now notice how there's nothing in focus in this picture except the bear and the fish. And that's, you know, that's great. It's the only choice I had. I had to have a big hole in the lens, no depth of field. But look, the water in the foreground is soft. The water in the background's out of focus. Well, I had no other choice. Wide open aperture, f2.8, that's what you get, just the bear and the fish. They were very close, and so that means that you get an even more blurring effect in the background. All that water with ripples on it just goes away. In this case, it's great. I didn't want anything in focus besides the bear and the fish anyway, but no choice, as I've said. When you're shooting in very low light on a subject that's moving, even if you're using a flash, you're going to want the fastest shutter speed you can get, otherwise everything's going to be a blurry mess. And in late light, that means a big hole in your lens. All right. So you want a very big hole in the lens, which gives you very little depth of field in this case, and it makes your subject pop out. You want as big a hole in the lens as possible in order to increase your shutter speed, right? Aperture and shutter speed walk hand in hand, remember. When you're shooting in low light, you're going to want that big hole in the lens. That river had a lot of ripples and waves on it. We don't see any of it. We're not distracted. So in this case, it all worked out great. We just wanted to see the bear. That's what I wanted to see. So I'm shooting a wide open aperture to help me isolate my subjects from the backgrounds. Very important. Let's look at one more picture here. Okay, this is a katydid on a leaf, backyard. Look, the only thing in focus here is a little bit of the insect's front end and its eye. It still works because it's so clean, very few distractions. That's the nature of macro lens, isn't it? Very little depth of field. I don't have any depth of field here, really. And this shallow depth of field produced by a wide open aperture is really visible when using a long lens, which is a telephoto or a macro lens. I consider a macro lens a long lens because of the blurring effect it has and the fact that any bumps or jostles really blur your world. You have to keep the camera fairly steady. This is very typical of a macro lens, by the way. Very little in focus. You can try changing to a higher f-stop number where you have a tiny hole in the lens and you'll get a bit more focus, but you really get very little depth of field if you're close to the subject with a macro. No matter what your f-stop is, you don't get a whole lot of depth of field. There are some exceptions, but not really. We'll talk more about shooting with a macro lens in a later lecture, but for me, with this picture, having a little sharp is just fine, okay? So now let's go into the field to see how depth of field can really help you or hurt you back home in Nebraska again. Okay, it's assignment time, everybody, and we're going to talk about aperture and depth of field. This is kind of a tricky one, isn't it? But we know what to do. We know that a big hole in the lens, very little depth of field. Tiny hole in the lens, lots of depth of field. So we have three lovely models here, and we have a terrible background. We have tree limbs sticking down into their heads. How are we going to fight this? How are we going to really craft this image so it reads well? Well, I know already that if at f/22, the tiny hole in the lens, I'm going to shoot that right now. I can see tree limbs sharp as can be. Everything's sharp in this frame from where I'm standing all the way to the horizon to infinity, because I'm at f/22, the smallest hole in the lens. And I see tree limbs sticking right into Esther's head, right into her eyes. No good. Let's try to open that up a little bit more, make the hole a little bigger. Let's go to f/8. That's about middle of the road. Let's try it again. Here we go. A little bit better. I can still see the other girls in the background. I know we're in a foresty scene. I know we're in walnut trees, but the limbs are a little bit softer. But you know what? I already know. If I open this thing up all the way, biggest hole in the lens, f/28, I shoot this, those limbs just really vanish. It's implications of limbs back there now. They're not sharp. It's just a hint of a forest. It's a hint of other girls in colorful dresses. And I have solved a visual problem right there by my depth of field. I have made that depth of field very shallow. I'm just sharp on Esther's face. Problem solved. So that's what I want you guys to do at home, all right? Try all the different apertures on your camera. Shoot something in which you have a cluttered background and you make that background, you tame that background by going with a real shallow depth of field. Or conversely, try to get everything in focus. I know a lot of people like everything in focus. That's fine, but really watch it. If you're on f/22, you watch what's in that background. Don't let it kill your subject. Don't let it get in the way of what you want to say. And go ahead, try it. That soft focus or very shallow depth of field is really outstanding, isn't it? It's the way I fix tree limbs and power lines and sticking out of heads all the time. I do it all the time with what I call soft focus or very shallow depth of field. If I take a picture of somebody in the woods, I don't want every tree in focus. I want to imply there are trees there softly and subtly. All I want is my subject in focus most of the time. There are exceptions, but most of the time I just want one thing to be sharp. Something interesting, compelling, a good feature, usually the eyes of the subject, but not every single detail. To make a subject stand out in a very busy place like the woods or a city scene with a shallow depth of field is a lovely way to handle this. It really is. Mark of a professional, really. I love the way that a shallow depth of field gives you just a hint or an impression of a place without really showing you the place. It's more lyrical and subtle and not obvious. I'm a big fan of going beyond the obvious, which everybody does, right? A shallow depth of field is a beautiful way to handle the chaos of life. Let's look at some photos here now that give you just a hint of what's behind you. Example, redbud trees, okay? They're implied and they're soft by nature. They just look beautiful and lyrical in the spring. So the background in these pictures, look at how it adds to this but doesn't distract. We're going to start out kind of wide. Watch this. Everything's there. We know it's a red bud because of the color, but watch. We're going to go through these a little bit closer now, a little bit closer. Okay. Now we're talking. Look at this. Little less depth of field, a lot less actually, a longer lens coming in closer. We just get the implication of trees in the background. See there? Get in. You can do it with when there's a little sun on as well. You can imply there's big mature trees in the background and really make these things pop out. But we use a little bit longer lens and kind of zoom in and have a very shallow depth of field to make these work. Very shallow depth of field. f/28 here. Look at that. Just the stuff that you want is in focus. That's the way to go. Now, again, very shallow depth of field. Daughter Ellen is standing there. There we go. So that's how you do it. I hope you'll try shooting that with a wide open aperture, a big hole in the lens whenever you can. It'll really make your subject stand out. And it's really necessary when you're working in low light anyway, because you want that big hole in the lens to gather in all that low light and really embrace it. Work in low, subtle light. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that it's only the bigger apertures that are useful, you know, the big holes in the lens. Sometimes you want different subjects at multiple distances in focus. And for that, you've got to use the smaller apertures, those with the high f-stop numbers. So that you don't think that I'm anti-depth of field, let's take a look at a few photos here that make use of high f-stops and why they work just fine as well. Okay, so These are for a story on America's State Fairs I did for National Geographic magazine. I was shooting a story on, well, in this case, the opening of the Iowa State Fair to start the story. Fairly strong light in most cases. Lots of color, lots of stuff going around, and I wanted to try to show everything that was cooking, in this scene especially. I wanted to show subtle light in some, vibrant, visual noise in others, all the stuff that state fairs are all about. So I often had a small home lens in order to show all this. The start of the Iowa State Fair, the midway Barker at the Texas State Fair. This is actually a mirror illusion, and it's very cool. But look at how we have lots of depth of field back through this picture. Lots. Not a ton, but an implication. We've at least got here, and we get the feeling of where we are, a feeling of it. Again, enough depth of field so that we can see where we are. We know that this guy's a high diver. Plenty depth of field here. Look at this. Most of the stuff's in focus, sharp. Not as sharp as they are, of course, but enough to really see where we are. And this, wow, a lot of depth of field here. This is again at the Texas State Fair during their auto show. Look at all the advertising. Very busy. It's a very busy scene. I chose a lot of depth of field here to make it look even more chaotic and cluttered. I wanted that look. I wanted everything focused. That's fine. In this case, a little less depth of field, but still pretty chaotic. These yellow shirts really help stand out and give us an anchor point besides here. I don't know if there's a right or wrong way to do this, by the way. I'm just winging it. I'm just trying to make things work. In this case, I wanted a little bit more depth of field. Believe it or not, they're spaying and neutering dogs and cats in vet surgical tents at the Iowa State Fair to I wanted to show the crowd watching this. A lot of people pass out when it's bloody, believe it or not. But I wanted to show this. There's a couple of fairs that do this now. And they have a picture window here that's plastic. People look in. And I wanted to show that. So I needed a little depth of field to carry that through. And this, a little auction down at Texas. Lots of depth of field here and here and here and back. Lots of layers here. Lots of layers. We want to try to show that. So sometimes it's critical. If this guy had been all blurry, it wouldn't have been as effective a picture. I wanted lots of things in focus. Fortunately, it's a nice bright scene, which allows for a tiny hole in the lens, and we can get lots of depth of field. So let me say that again. Smaller apertures, those with higher f-stop numbers, can help you make sure that everything's in focus, or at least that most of the stuff's in focus, and you kind of imply where you are. Apertures are a fairly straightforward subject, but it can get complicated to figure out how much depth of field you need. Lots of times it's subjective. It really depends on what you feel like doing. So let me show you a good variety here so you can begin to get a feeling for the range of options. Always, I encourage you to practice. Spin the aperture dial around and see what you get. If you don't like it, try again. Remember, I mean, look, a guitar only has 6 strings on it, and yet it's kind of difficult. It takes a lot of practice, right? Same with photography. There's just a few basic controls. It's just a matter of practice, running lots and lots of pictures through your camera. So let's look at a few more frames. Okay, what about this one? Here we are in Antarctica in bright sun. There's lots of potential for depth of field here. I'm at f16 or f22. It's the middle of the day. The sun's beating down. These penguins aren't going anywhere. It's the height of summer. Everything is sharp because I'm staying a little far away from the birds and I've got a really small hole in the lens. So everything's sharp, okay? Now this one, about an f16 aperture. This is kind of a gray day, but I'm hitting this northern spotted owl in a clear cut with a lot of light from a big flash with a softbox on it, okay? He's an educational bird, one that's been injured. You can see the little leather straps or jesses that basically keep him there. So this is a controlled situation. He's not flying anywhere. It's a captive controlled bird. So I've got time to work this, which is really nice. This was for a story on the Endangered Species Act for National Geographic. I wanted to show that a northern spotted owl can't live if you cut all the trees down. Pretty obvious thing, but something most people don't think about. And so there we go. Wanted a lot of depth of field. We're set for f16 here, okay? Everything's sharp, from the straps on his feet all the way to the mountains in the background, just about, even the clouds. I wanted to show the mess and the chaos. I just didn't want the owl to be the only thing sharp, right? I wanted everything to be sharp. The owl stands out because he's lit a little bit brighter. That's how we're doing it in this case, right? But a tiny hole in the lens, right? You'll find that there are some really good reasons to have everything in focus in your pictures sometimes. Let's look at this one. Monarch butterflies down in Mexico. Middle of the morning, the sun's blaring. The sun's at the middle of the morning. You see a little flare from the sun in the background. That's this f/22. Tiny hole in the lens gives you that little starburst pattern. Everything's sharp from top to bottom. And sometimes that's okay. In this case, perfectly appropriate. And I didn't know how to do it anyway because I'm competing with the sun, even at 200 ISO or 100 ISO. A lot less sensitivity to light on that sensor. You still have to really crank that aperture down to compete with the sun in the middle of the day. In each of these images then, the backgrounds were critical to how I wanted the viewer to read the photo. A narrow aperture or a small hole can come in handy when you need to show background detail, but as you probably know about me by now, I generally find myself avoiding it. I tend to blur backgrounds. It's hard enough to make your subject stand out when the whole world is in focus. Remember, everything does not have to be in focus to make a good frame, so make choices. Don't just default to a single aperture setting for every single picture. Experiment with your camera and see what you can come up with. You'll surprise yourself. Okay, aperture and depth of field go hand in hand. Another relationship that's really important for you to understand is between the amount of light available and your aperture setting. For a narrow aperture, let's say f/22 or higher even, you need either light, really strong light, or you need a slow shutter speed. A lot of light or a slow shutter, or both sometimes. Hope that makes sense to you. If you got a tiny hole in the lens, you want bright light or a slow shutter speed so that enough light hits the sensor to give you a properly exposed picture. Does that make sense? I hope so. This complicates things, doesn't it? You remember for the last lecture, when you used a slow shutter speed, you're going to have to put the camera on a tripod because a camera shake and use a cable release. Sometimes you're just going to have to hand hold it, and that's okay too if you can stand it and you don't have any other choice. So again, for this picture, we come back to it again, but it's talking about a lot of things in this one picture. I did not have the time to set up a tripod and a cable release. I was in a boat on a river, bouncing all over the place. There's no doing any of that, even if I was on land, because he's bobbing for salmon and he's moving everywhere, and so was I. Again, a low f-stop number for the grizzly eating salmon. Low f-stop, big hole to let all the light in. You'll be able to make that shutter speed increase as much as possible. That's the key. So you can't use a tripod all the time. You just can't. Fast lenses, the ones with wide maximum apertures, big holes, and low f-stop numbers, will allow you to shoot in low light, which is often the best light to me. They cost more, but they are so worth it. Cheap lenses are cheap for a reason. The optics aren't as good. They sometimes won't be tack sharp too. So in desperation, you have to make that hole smaller in your lens to get the subject in focus. And then of course you've got to worry about whether you've got enough light for that small hole. You may increase the distractions in the background too with all that increased depth of field. So spend your money on good lenses if at all possible, please. It's really critical. I learned that in college. Spend your money on good glass, okay? This is a photograph I took recently just out at a pond with a friend of mine and her boys. This is one I could not have shot without an f2.8 lens and a modern digital SLR, right? This is well after sunset. Look at the light, soft and glowy and even, well after the sun's gone down. The kids are wiggling and the fish is flopping, everybody's excited. I needed a fast shutter speed to freeze the action. This frame is at an 800th of a second, wow. That my camera can produce a good image at ISO 1250 didn't hurt either. Remember, ISO is the sensor's sensitivity to light, right? How sensitive is it to low light? Back in the days of film, I would have had to pick up and go home at this point in the evening. So long after sunset, there's no way. You couldn't shoot back then this late. But now look at this. It's like middle of the day almost. I'm back far enough from the subject so we have good depth of field here, right? It goes throughout the boat. Doesn't go beyond the boat much. You can see the moss and the hills in the background, but they're all soft. Everybody in the boat's sharp though, even though I'm at a wide open aperture because I'm back a little farther from my subjects and I'm using a wide angle lens. Very important there. Here's another one. Nice soft light at the end of the day. I'm in focus. The rest of the world goes slightly out of focus. This is a nice effect using a wide open lens and a wide angle wide open lens. You can see I'm holding a 400 millimeter here. It's a nice lens to use in low light. To say the least, one I use all the time. This is an f4. It has an f4 aperture. Really nice lens. You can see how big the lens of the end of that lens is. It is not for impressing your fellow photographers. It is heavy. You get over that real fast. It's for gathering lots of light when the light's low. I know it's heavy. I know it's cumbersome to carry with you. It gives you a pain in the neck. But you know what? Boy, it's worth it. That is a really nice lens, a fine lens. My assistant Katie took this picture. So again, I'm in focus and the rest of the world goes soft, and that's a nice way to shoot this. Long lenses like this also come in handy for portraits. It's a quick way to clean up a background, as I mentioned in the last lecture. Long lenses clean up backgrounds wonderfully. Okay, what else? This one of my little boy Spencer being fed out in the backyard. He's a little messy, isn't he? Just like his dad, I guess. You know, that's woods. We're in woods, so we have a nice open shade source. It wasn't like we're out in a cave or anything. It's just that long lens with dark woods behind him really fall off well. With that long lens, I've exposed for the highlights here in the white and the brightness of Spencer and everything around him. So everything else goes dark because of that long lens. There's no detail in the background. Even though it was complicated, chaotic woods, no detail. Nice and smooth and dark. And that's nice. It makes everything we want to see pop out nice and clean. The background is just full of bushes and trees and vines and other stuff I didn't want showing up. By using a nice lens with a wide open aperture, a big hole or small number, I clean up my backyard visually. Boy, that's handy. A lot handier than actually cleaning up the backyard, I can tell you. Now, you remember from lecture 3 when we were at Raptor Recovery, Nebraska in Elmwood? Look at the backgrounds here. See how the background shifts? You see that? That's what we're talking about. Depth of field. Let's run these again. Look at this. Lots of depth of field, small homo lens. A little bit less. Maybe we're at f5.6 here, maybe f8. Look at that. We're at f2.8 now. Look at this. We're talking about focal length. We're talking about how we can change our depth of field just using that aperture. So beautiful. Using a short or wide angle lens in this case. It really, really helps. It works. He pops right out. I like this the best out of those 3. With a wide angle lens, more things will be in focus and the whole world will be there, right? But you pick what you want to. You choose it. Use your brains and think. As you learn more and shoot more pictures, you're going to find yourself making more interesting choices. When to blur the background, when to leave in the complexity and chaos. There's a time and a photograph for everything. I'd like to say a word about buying a longer lens here too while we're talking about them. It's worth your time to try it before you buy it. You can even go rent one and try it out on the subjects you want to photograph. But you really should hold it in your own hands before you buy something online, let's say. You can see if you like the feel of it, the weight of it especially. You don't want to buy something that you don't want to lug around. If it's going to just stay in your closet gathering dust because it's too heavy or cumbersome, that's no good. So rent one and try it before you buy it. They are big, they are heavy, and man, they are expensive. But they're absolutely essential for a lot of wildlife or sports. Remember that. So your assignment. I want you to shoot the same scene, one that has a subject in the foreground, and then bring things into focus in the background by making the hole in your lens smaller. This will show you the relationship of aperture to depth of field. I tried this myself in my office with my staff just for fun. Here's Katie in the foreground, then Rebecca and Grace. Okay, watch this. We're really putting it together now, okay? Look, we're just making the hole in the lens a little bit smaller in each frame. A little bit smaller hole. We start out on 2.8. Look at this. We're getting smaller and smaller. Look. Now we got lots of depth of field here. Now, just to repeat, first frame, no depth of field, f2.8, just Katie sharp. And now lots of depth of field. Small hole in the lens, just about everybody's sharp. Really easy little thing to do. Quite easy. So look at this. Equipment, lenses, shutter speed, aperture, depth of field. Now we need to talk about light next. Light is going to be the subject of your pictures next. There's a lot to learn about light itself and how to use it, but to me, it's the most fun thing. To control light and make your photos better. Man, there is nothing better than light. Its variety is infinite. I love it. It's a fun, fun lecture, so come right back, please.